Welcome to ZekeTalk. This is Jim Tudor of ZekeFilm.org. And it's a pleasure today to have with us Dr. Mark D. Eckel. Mark's been a terrific contributor at our Zeke Film discussion group. He's a film buff, a professor, an educator, a public speaker. He's reviewed films. He loves films. He does a lot more than that, though. Mark, pleasure to have you here.
Oh, thanks so much, Jim. I really do appreciate the invitation, and it's great to talk with other people about movies.
Absolutely. Well, Mark, you've written quite a few books.
Yes.
And the two that we're going to focus on here, I believe, are your most recent endeavors. We've got this one, of course.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yep.
And visitors to the Zeke Film homepage may recognize this, as we've had a banner up for several months. So anyone interested, as we go through this chat today, if you like what you're hearing and you want to read Mark's book, When the Lights Go Down, Movies Reviewed as Christian Practice, you can go to our website, ZekeFilm.org, and click on that banner, and hopefully that will all work out nicely to get you a copy of the book you can purchase.
There you go.
We have another one. This one you are a contributor to.
All right.
One of many.
Yes.
And this one's a little more. We're going to talk about both books. We'll get to this one second, but this one it's one of these essay collections.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Spearheaded, I presume, by somebody else.
Yes, exactly. The two editors there, one of whom is actually a philosopher, and that's Mark Boone, and Mr. Neese is a cultural critic. So they kind of combine their energies here to connect on this particular topic, connecting C.S. Lewis's famous book, Abolition of Man, with science fiction, TV, and movies. It's really quite something.
Yeah, it really is. And we'll talk about this more in just a second, but just to tease, we've got C.S. Lewis talk on the way, everybody. So I know from my years of attending and being involved in various, Christian festivals and kind of side tents, like Imaginopolis is one that I have been involved with, that is a venue within a festival at
Yes.
the Audio Feed Festival, which is every summer. It's a Christian music festival, but it's every summer in Urbana. And Imaginopolis is a little section where we can watch movies and play games and talk about literature and whatever else it is, fantasy, geek stuff, all those things that we like. I'm hoping to go this year. I don't know if I myself will be there. Zeke Film had a presence last year as I helped that along. But anyway, all that to say, anytime you put C.S. Lewis in the program with a lecture or something that people can come to,
yes,
you fill the tent.
That's right. That's right.
At these things. So that's why I tease C.S. Lewis is coming up. So don't go anywhere, anyone. This book we're going to talk about first. But first, before we even talk about this book, Mark, I'd like to hear about your own, what brought you to the point of wanting to write a book about movie review as Christian practice.
Sure.
You're a professor. You've got a lot going on.
Yep.
Tell us about yourself.
Sure. So I'm really an old high school teacher, honestly. I started teaching in 1983, and I started teaching junior high through high school students. And I've been teaching high school off and on for about 20 years, actually. So that really is where I cut my teeth, as it were, on these kinds of things. And what I discovered, even in the 1980s, was that film was very important, that the visual imagery that students were engaging on a regular basis needed to be thoughtfully engaged. So that's what I was doing in the 80s and 90s, especially, was teaching them how to watch movies. Now, at the MA and PhD levels, I'm actually teaching courses like theological interpretation of media. So we take it to a different level, and we're actually teaching leaders and other leaders how to do this kind of thing. But going back to the high school days, honestly, this is the real real deal, I think, helping young people to think differently about what they're seeing and hearing, and taking them through the process, not only about how the camera lens is held, but scene transitions and characterization and dialogue, and what does the director want to accomplish in this particular film. All kinds of different approaches to this. So that's really where this all started for me. And I was always excited about movies. I still am excited about film. I don't get a chance to engage it as much now as I wanted to. Just for the sake of saying it, there will never be a volume 2 of that movie book. That was a one and done kind of setting and situation for me. But since you asked generally about who I am and what I do, I deal with lots of different things, lots of different interests. I'm a content provider for various groups. I teach for a homeschool group. As I suggested, I teach MA and PhD courses. So I'm also a writer. I'm actually writing a book, basically a story memoir of my own educational experiences. I could go on and on and on here, but there's lots of different streams that make up this river, as it were. And I'm really glad to be able to talk with you today about these kinds of ideas.
Well, it's fantastic to have you here, and I really appreciate kind of the, despite all your experience and your degrees and whatnot, you still are humble enough to step into the homeschool realm and things like that. These are not big arenas. This is I know that from experience as well. We've homeschooled our own kids, my wife and I, Silwyn, and educating them on what you're talking about, how you used the phrase early on there, how to watch movies.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And you just kind of threw that out there, and that's something I want to come back to.
Sure.
Teaching young people how to watch movies, and not just movies, but process images, moving
Right.
images and still images, and discern them, and what's really going on with these images is something that is, for my money, not nearly taught enough in the public school setting and other school settings as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
At this point, my own belief is that it's, the world we live in, visual literacy is something that needs to be taught alongside of traditional literacy.
Right.
So when
Yes.
you say how to watch movies, can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure.
From your point of view?
Sure. So I would actually show full-length feature films. Obviously, when you're teaching in high school, generally speaking, you only have about a 40 to 45-minute window during any given class period. So this would go on for maybe about 3 days in a row. But I literally was teaching them how to write movie reviews. So I would focus the attention on what is the thesis, just like you would any other kind of paper. But what is it that you want to say about this particular movie? They had to give various examples. It might be about dialogue, it might be about characterization, however that might come across for them. But their interest level then was accelerated. I'll kind of fast forward to the end of this and say, if you were to ask any of my students today, in their 30s and 40s now, what did they remember from Eckel's teaching? I would say that they would, among other things, at some junctures tell you, Eckel ruined watching movies for me forever.
Oh, no.
And what they mean by that is that I taught them the tools of analysis, interpretation, what are people's points of view, how are, let's say, ethical ideas coming through any given film. I think of a movie like Extreme Measures, for instance, where there was this great dialogue with Gene Hackman, who's the evil doctor who's killing people in order to actually find a cure for paralysis. And there's this great interview that takes place right in the middle of the film. And so I would even lift film clips out. The need for young people at any juncture you have to be honest with them. Because you can't blow smoke with kids, honestly. They're going to figure it out. They're going to know hypocrisy when they see it. So you have to teach them the tools of analysis. You have to teach them the tools of interpretation. You have to show them how directors have come to any given conclusion that they might have. and be honest with what people actually believe and think, and try not to hide anything, because they're going to find out anyway. I mean, they all got smartphones in their pockets. So all of that to say, I still love doing that, and I do it in various venues. Give you one example of this. I teach a course for high school students on Gothic horror literature.
Awesome.
So we're talking about Dracula, Frankenstein, Jekyll and Hyde. And at the end of the course, they have to create a practicum, which is 1/4 of their whole grade. And they have to create a visual prompt, something that they learned, and they create it with their hands. Last year, I had 2 young men combine in a partnership to create an 8-minute short horror film. It was absolutely phenomenal. When you give young people an opportunity to, you teach them about how to do these things, and then you allow them to do these things, oh my word, it's great stuff. I love it.
That's the ideal. Turn them loose with a camera, huh?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. So, well, that's really cool. And they made a Gothic horror film?
They did. It was a 7 to 8 minute short, and it really was a film about addiction, but they showed the horror through facial expressions specifically, but a lot of makeup. So they actually had a makeup artist involved in this as well. It was just really great. You know, like you said, when you let kids go and do their thing, I am always impressed by the imagination young people have.
Well, that's fantastic, man. That sounds really cool, and a very rare opportunity, particularly within the Christian stratosphere. You know, to you know, really dig into something as I don't know, to this day, maybe, you know, feared and shunned as Gothic horror.
Yes.
And I'd like to mention, just an aside, years ago, I had the good fortune of attending a seminar by well, I don't know if he's still out there working as a pastor or whatnot, an East Coast pastor named Paul Leggett, who wrote a book about Gothic horror, and the Hammer horror film director Terence Fisher, who you know, was a believer in his lifetime, and would pepper his Hammer horror films of the 1950s. You know, these are the films with Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, Dracula and Frankenstein films with, you know, you can look at them and it's not a stretch to derive, you know, elements of his beliefs from those Gothic horror films.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, this is wonderful stuff, and you can acquaint young people with all different kinds of ideas, and they absolutely love it. I had another in this case, I had a young woman who's an artist who created the Last Girl phenomenon in various visual images. I had another young woman who was really invested in music, and she actually wrote two original horror movie scores. Now, it's really fascinating because in her case, she doesn't like watching horror films, and she never does. But in order to get the pathos of the film, to communicate this in a verbal way, now for her it would be verbal in the sense of audio. She just took off with this, and it was fantastic stuff. I just can't get over young people and their abilities to do these kinds of things in a wonderful way.
And that sounds great. Again, for anyone watching, we may have just either steered into a realm of unrelatability or a minefield. You know, for those wondering, you know, why, you know, well, I would think it's probably relatively self-explanatory why Christians are averse to horror.
Yes.
You know, there's blood, there's violence, there's unpleasantry there. There's all kinds of, in horror films, they tend to indulge various exploitative elements that,
right,
you know, are problematic.
Yes, of course.
Okay, so those are there, and they've always been there to varying degrees. That said, for anybody who might be skittish and on the fence about horror, why should a thinking person watch these films?
Right. I would say generally, I I would say that if you're really skittish about it, don't watch them. I mean,
Yeah.
there are some of my friends who say, I don't want to open myself up to those things. And I get that. That's not a problem for me at all. Everybody's going to be different. But I will tell you two things that are definitely true about all horror films. And these two ideas are all woven through these movies. So the first one I would say is that there is a supernatural world. Every single horror film deals with a supernatural world in one way or another. So if you like the concept of supernatural world or you don't, if you're a Christian or you're not a Christian, doesn't really matter. Those horror films deal with supernatural issues. The second issue that's always true in every horror film is that there is evil that must be defeated. Now, how you go about defeating the evil, that's going to be a whole different ballgame, depending again on where you're coming from. But nonetheless, those two ideas, a supernatural world and evil that must be defeated, are in every single horror movie. And so those two ideas are really what attract me as a theologian. And then, of course, what attracts students, I think, to this endeavor as well.
And we should mention, of course, quite often the evil isn't defeated, and that's just how both stories end. But it's still, it must be defeated. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't by the end. That's part of it.
Right.
And usually, and this is something that I find interesting, there are rules.
Right.
There's a very specific, you have to do this and you have to do that. You have to go get this thing to do this other thing to defeat the villain.
That's right.
And that's something I think that a lot of believers can relate to, practitioners of various faiths and whatnot.
Right.
So, yeah, no, so, okay, so that's our little horror film sidebar, and I hope everybody enjoyed that. If you don't mind, I'll put you on the spot. Are there any particular films of that genre that come to mind as worthwhile, particularly worthwhile?
Yes. I'm really one of those guys that goes back to some of the older films because I think the older films in some ways bring out ideas and themes that are not always present in all horror films today. So my first thought whenever anybody asks me about this is I'm going to go back to something like The Thing. The Thing is a horror / thriller / sci-fi kind of movie, but it gets into all of these intricate threads, the issue of human fear, the issue of an outside evil that's now penetrated our environment, our existence, the idea of what we just discussed, how do we go about defeating this? How does this relate to the creation, when all of the dogs become invested with these creatures and so on? There are so many different ways to go with this. And so just to bring out an example like The Thing suggests that horror can go in so many different directions. Then you go to somebody like a Scott Derrickson, for instance, who's done The Exorcism of Emily Rose, Deliver Us from Evil. And what's really fascinating about Scott's work is that he is a guy who takes original true stories, or at least based on true events, and he magnifies it, or at least allows that event to speak for itself in the horror genre. He's doing fantastic work because I think what he does is he goes back to something that somebody or some group or something has happened and we want an explanation for it. And there's the other issue of horror. We want an explanation. We may not understand it, and we might not get a period at the end of that sentence at the end of the movie, but we still want to know, and we want to try to understand, and I think that's huge in horror.
It really is, and Derrickson is the one who I believe said that he makes horror films unapologetically, or at least he did before his big mainstream breakthrough with Dr. Strange last year.
Yes.
Which he directed quite fantastically. He's the one who said sometimes, confusion and damnation is the end of this particular story.
Right.
That doesn't mean there's no hope anywhere else, but sometimes
right.
For that can be the end. And that's a challenging thought. Let's talk about your book here.
Sure.
This came out in 2014. Am I right?
That's right. Yep.
Okay. Now, in this book, this is an interesting book because, and full disclosure, I'm part of this book. You invited myself and several other Zeke Film contributors of the time to talk to you, to fill out your questionnaire, and and we sent that into you, and so I've got my little chunk in here. I'm also pull quoted on the back cover here, which is a fantastic honor. I think this is the only pull quote I've got to my name so far, and I've been in this film reviewing, racket for 12 plus years now. So
okay.
This is what I've got to show. You go through and review a few films. You talk about No Country for Old Men, the Coen brothers Oscar-winning film from 2006.
Yes.
You talk about Juno, another 2006 film, and quite interestingly, Take Shelter.
Yes.
And so and you have guidelines for each of these. Let's take a minute and talk about your guidelines, if you don't mind.
Sure. Let me just kind of fill out for everybody what the book actually looks like. There are about 15 sections of this book, and each section is divided into 5 pieces. So there are 2 essays that I write. Then there is an interview with somebody who is an expert in the field. At least I view them as an expert in the field. And then I actually give a film review, a full film review from myself, for each of those sections. So a horror film, a thriller, a love story, whatever. And then finally, at the end of each section are 10 questions. And these 10 questions are directed toward that particular genre of film or that particular issue. For instance, there are sections on POV, point of view, or interpretation, those kinds of ideas, where people can look at this and say, hey, I don't know how to go about doing film review. How do I do that? So we actually point some of those kinds of things out. You're right, we've enlisted the aid of some of the reviewers actually on Zeke Film are in there, which is really kind of cool. And really have appreciated what you all have done at Zeke Film for some time. But the book is something that I think is very user-friendly. It gives you kind of an overview of lots of different ideas, and there are hundreds of films invested there. I suppose if I were going to do anything over again, I would say the book really needs an index so that you can go and say, gee, I wonder if he talked about this film or whatever. But I think the book is by itself something that can be user-friendly, not just for the individual, but even for class structures. Maybe you want to have a film discussion group. Maybe you want to use the book as a film discussion basis. I mean, I use it in my classes. I know other people around the country have used it in their own class structures. You can go a lot of different ways with it. It was really a labor of love for me. Right. So I'm glad for anybody that's able to find it of use.
Yeah, and this again, it's great. It's called When the Lights Go Down. Movie review as Christian practice. I want to make sure I say the title for the audio version of this interview. When the Lights Go Down is the title, and you can get this through Amazon. And is that the preferred way for people to get it, Mark?
Oh yeah, I think it's probably the easiest way, and probably the way that most folks will do it. Sure.
Right, and Zeke Film, one big thing we always encourage is the discussions of films.
Yes.
Getting together with people, and it doesn't need to be real formal. You can just sit on the couch and have fun chats talking about your favorite parts. It doesn't need to be all heady. It can be.
Right.
Some people very much enjoy that.
Yes.
But and for those, there is this book is something. That you, like Mark said, you can use as a guide. I for years have been, hosting film discussions on and off in various venues. And to this day, I'm still learning how to do it.
Sure.
I think
the key to any discussion is developing questions. And so, we have a radio show once a week, for instance, here in Indianapolis. That's something else I do. I mean, I haven't told you all of the different things I do in my life, but what I do is actually develop a series of questions for my interviewees. And so I send them ahead of time, a week ahead, and we talk about those kinds of things. I think that's really an easy way to go about film discussion, is just write out questions and let people think through the process themselves.
Tell us about where can people find your radio show?
Yeah, so you can go to a couple of different places. You can go to warpandwoof.org. That's warpandwoof.org. That's my personal website. There are 500 essays on there. There are videos on there, audios, various podcasts. All of the podcasts are listed there. That's warpandwoof.org. And then the website for our nonprofit here in Indianapolis is the Comenius Institute. And you can go to comeniusinstitute.org. That's COMENIUS, comeniusinstitute.org. We're actually having the website redone at the moment, and we'll have a new one up here in a few weeks. But it's one of those things, once again, where I'm interacting, in this case, with college young people, actually on a university campus here in Indianapolis. So I do go in lots of different directions. I have conversations with lots of different folks. I'm just interested in dialogue and seeing what other people believe.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm going to try, I'll do my best to add links for all of those that you just mentioned here in the YouTube version of this video. Let's go to the long-teased C.S. Lewis compilation here, which you've written. A very early chapter here in the book. I think this is actually the very first proper chapter after the introduction,
right?
By Mark J. Boone. Your chapter is called "Monsters in the Mirror."
Yes.
And like you'd mentioned, you guys are all riffing on C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man through the filter of film and television.
Yes.
So give us the rundown on your essay, Mark.
On my essay, I'm a big believer in being very concerned about technology and its influence. I'm certainly not a Luddite. I'm on your program right now, but we also we have to be concerned about the question of should we. So I think, just to give an example of this, one of the great questions that comes out of film, and of course comes out of Michael Crichton's book, Jurassic Park, 1995 film, is the great question. The question is not can we, but should we? Yeah. And so the question, I think, that comes out of science fiction film is that kind of ethical question. And science fiction really deals with all kinds of right and wrong issues. So when we talk about technology, for instance, let's take a movie like The Island, for instance, where you've got a couple of robotic / human beings running around trying to get away from the dictatorial state, as it were. You have here a situation where we are all confronted with the same kind of question, and that is, what kind of problems do technology actually create for us? And how do they then invade our own humanness? And are there questions then that deal with how do we teach young people, but what should we be warning young people about? That is, how do we get them ready to face the ethical questions that they're going to be dealing with in the future? I often will tell my students, look, man, I'm teaching 18-year-olds, and I just turned 60. And I tell them, man, I'm going to be hitting the dirt a long time before you all do. So I won't be around always to answer your questions. So here are the tools that you need to, and the tools really are just questions. And you have to keep questioning so that you get after the real issues. And the real issues in science fiction film, and out of my particular essay, have to do with the question of right and wrong and should we. But ultimately, I actually end my particular essay focused on something that I think sometimes we forget about in terms of science fiction, and that is the great question of hope. We all are interested in hope. I often will tell people we can live 40 days without food, 3 days without water, 10 minutes without air, but not 1 second without hope. And that really is what drives us as human beings. The great question of life is one that we ask all the time. That is, where do I come from, and to whom do I give an account? And so who's my authority? Who ultimately is in charge? These are all of the great questions that come out of science fiction. And certainly in this wonderful new book, Science Fiction and the Abolition of Man, we have an opportunity to engage these kinds of great questions. And what C.S. Lewis was concerned about was the issue of men without chess. And what he meant by that was there's no virtue. We haven't built the interiority of the human person. So if there's no virtue, how can we then make actually interact properly with ethical questions of right and wrong? Because we don't have any basis from which to draw to answer those particular kinds of questions. And so that's what we're really getting after in this particular book. And there are 30 plus different people that are invested in this book, written essays on all manner of science fiction films, as well as television programs. I honestly think it's one of the most unique books I've ever seen, not just as a contributor to a book. Obviously, I'm excited about it for that reason, in the sense that I got an opportunity to participate with these other minds. Yeah. But to see one book, The Abolition of Man, C.S. Lewis's basic concept was, what is education doing to our young people? And are we doing something to education that is moving them away from a virtuous, the building of the interior of the person toward virtue? And so all of these essays are moving in that particular direction. But if I were going to punctuate it, I would say where I end up is the question of hope. What gives us hope? And science fiction film really does get after that issue.
Okay, well, that's fantastic. I've got the book open right here. I'm looking at the various contributors, and
yes.
You know, it looks like we've got pieces on the film Blade Runner. We've even got a piece on the very first George Lucas feature film THX 1138.
Yes.
That is covered here. Green Lantern, the animated series, gets covered. You mentioned The Island, and we've got Gattaca here and another.
Right.
Louis Marcos, that's somebody I've met,
yes.
and have heard him speak live. Quite engaging. He wrote about the dangers of the materialist magician.
Yes.
So, you know, there's a lot here. Star Trek, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, and plenty more for the C.S. Lewis devotee and fans of Lewis's Abolition of Man here in the book Science Fiction and the Abolition of Man, Finding C.S. Lewis in Sci-Fi Film and Television. Brian Godawa did the foreword. Many people are familiar with him and his various online presence and writing. He wrote one of the seminal books, which the title honestly escapes me at the moment. But anyway, he's involved. And again, as you had mentioned early on, this is edited by Mark J. Boone and Kevin C. Neese, and that's worth seeking out as well.
It is.
Melody Green will be reviewing this book, I should say, for Zeke Film.
Great.
At some point this summer is the plan. So everybody will keep refreshing those browsers at zekefilm.org and check for that review. And in the meantime, there's plenty of other things to read there. Mark, before we wrap up, is there anything you're working on that you'd like to plug, and any closing thoughts and words?
Sure. So I am actually working on a book this summer on my educational experiences, which dovetail with philosophy as well as practical nature. But I'm a storyteller, so all of my essays are basically driven by stories, and you'll find that kind of thing in all of my writing, especially at warpandwoof.org. You'll see those kinds of things driven there by story. And I would say just again, thank you so much, Jim, and to Zeke Film, thank you for your wonderful presence online. You're doing something that's quite unique. The way that not only how your website is laid out, but it is the way that you've engaged so many different kinds of voices with so many different kinds of films. It's a real pleasure to go there. Thank you ever so much. I know it's a labor of love for you guys, but you do great work there. Thanks so much for that.
Well, thank you, man. That's high praise indeed. And I honestly hope that we can, get you here to St. Louis at some point, and have some sort of movie night or a discussion, or,
Sure.
or hear you speak, whatever it is.
Yeah.
That would be an amazing opportunity. And in the meantime, everybody, seek out Mark's books. Again, one more time, When the Lights Go Down, movie review is Christian Practice, and it's Mark D. Eckel, Eckel. Okay, and again, Science Fiction and the Abolition of Man, which is finding C.S. Lewis in sci-fi film and television. So, Mark, pleasure having you here today, and hope to talk to you in the future. And again, I just thank you for your participation in our discussion group, and at Zeke Film Discussion Group, and the other places where you are involved. Thanks so much.
Yeah, you bet, Jim. Thank you for the opportunity. I'll look forward to the future.
All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much. You can subscribe to the Zeke Film YouTube channel. We encourage you to do that. And we have regular episodes of ZekeTalk where we will have hopefully more interviews like this, and we'll have our regular weekly or thereabouts programs where we talk about just the movies we've seen and what's new, very casual chats there. So again, that's the ZekeTalk show here at the Zeke Film channel. And everybody have a great week. We'll see you later.